They said nothing could survive out there, not the crops, not the fences, not even hope. For 20 years, Calder Hayes stayed away from the land that had taken everything from him. But when age and sickness finally drove him home to the ashes of Three Winds Ranch, he expected only ghosts and dust. What he found waiting in the silence, alive, wild and watching, would rewrite everything the town thought it knew about life loss and the land that remembers. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun was sinking over Dry Creek, painting the world in a color somewhere between rust and blood. The wind came dry and steady, rolling across miles of dead grass that whispered like paper. Dust rose from the hooves of the old sorrel-gelding buckshot buck for short, each step stirring a ghost from the earth. Calder Hayes sat straight in the saddle despite the years bent into his back. His leather coat, once black, had faded to the dull brown of weathered bark. His hat was frayed, his beard half white, half gray, his eyes bleached pale by the sun and the years. 61, though the trail had carved a few more decades into him than the calendar ever would. The horse's breathing matched his own, slow, rasping, honest. Behind them, the horizon burned, and ahead stretched the same road he had once taken in the opposite direction 20 years ago when he'd left everything behind. Now he was coming home, not because there was anything left to claim, but because dying anywhere else would feel like betrayal. The only sound was the wind and the steady rhythm of hooves against hard ground, a heartbeat between two ghosts. He remembered the last time this land had spoken to him. It was 20 years past the year the rains never came. The earth cracked like pottery cattle dropped where they stood, and the sky stayed pitiless for months. His wife Clara had withered alongside the land, coughing herself thin until her voice was only a whisper. The doctor from Tumbleweed Ridge said the dust had settled too deep in her lungs. When she passed, Calder buried her under the mesquite tree near the well, the ground so dry he had to break it with a crowbar before he could dig. By then, most of the horses had gone sold, starved or stolen by men, desperate enough to take anything that still moved. He'd stayed one more week staring at the ranch his father had built plank by plank, then rode out before dawn, not looking back. He never said goodbye to the land. The land didn't deserve his anger. He simply rode until the hills turned to plains and the plains turned to nowhere. The years since had been long and dust-colored. He'd driven freight wagons in New Mexico, hauled lumber in Nevada, and slept under roofs that never felt like his own. Work came and went, and so did people. Some called him Hayes, others old-timer. He never corrected them. He'd learned not to expect the world to remember names that even time had buried. Only Buck had stayed with him, a horse traded from a drifter outside Santa Fe, quiet, patient, loyal, in the way only something born of the plains could be. And now the cough that lived in Calder's chest had grown deep and heavy. The doctor called it consumption. Calder called it the end of the trail. He spat red dust into his palm, smiled thinly, and muttered to the wind, "If I gotta die, I'll die where the land still remembers my name." Buck flicked his ear as if he understood, and the two of them rode on beneath the bleeding sky. By the time they reached Tumbleweed Ridge, the day had gone thin and gold. The town hadn't changed much, just older, quieter, as though it too had forgotten how to breathe. The main street was a single stretch of dirt, flanked by tired buildings leaning against one another for support. The Rusty Spur Saloon still stood near the well, its sign hanging crooked, squeaking in the breeze. Calder dismounted, tied Buck to the post, and pushed through the swinging doors. Inside, the air smelled of whiskey and sawdust. A few faces turned, pausing mid-drink. Recognition flickered in some eyes, disbelief in others. To them, he was a ghost made of bone and dust. Hayes, one man said, finally squinting through the dim, "Ain't thought I'd ever see you again." Calder nodded once, voice rough. Didn't reckon I'd ever come back. Another laughed from the bar. That ranch died with your daddy Hayes. The room hummed with agreement. Quiet mean the way small towns sound when they smell weakness. Calder finished his drink in one swallow, set the glass down. His words came low but steady. Then I'll go, keep him company. A few men chuckled, but no one answered. He tipped his hat to the barkeep, turned and stepped back into the fading light. Outside, the wind was waiting, whistling through the street, like a tune from a memory no one wanted to hear. He climbed onto Buck's back, tugged the reins, and rode west as the sun bled into the horizon. Behind him, the town shrank to a shimmer of dust, and the laughter faded into nothing. Before him, the land stretched endless, dry as bone, and twice as quiet. The last 8 miles were the hardest. The old road that once ran straight and proud toward Three Winds Ranch had been half claimed by the desert. Evening had fallen by the time Calder reached the gates of Three Winds Ranch. The air was red with dust, the last of the daylight burning low on the horizon. Ahead stood the wrought iron gate he remembered from boyhood, its bars rusted, its hinges sagging under decades of wind and neglect. Across the top, the name still held Hayes, 1887. The letters were nearly eaten through, but they remained stubborn as the family that had built them. He reached out, laying a hand on the cold metal. It felt rough beneath his fingers, the kind of rust that stains your skin with the color of dried blood. When he pushed, the gate groaned open, long and slow, the sound echoing across the empty yard, like a sigh from the past. A swirl of dust rose in the dying light. Still standing, he murmured, "Guess you were too stubborn to fall." Behind him, Buck shifted his weight and exhaled the breath curling in the cooling air. Together, they stood for a moment, two shapes framed in fading gold, before stepping through into what once had been home. The house leaned sideways, as though trying to remember how to stand. Its roof sagged in the middle, boards warped and split from years of sun and rain. The porch had half collapsed. Weeds and dry thistle had grown up through the gaps in the floorboards, twisting toward the last light of day. Calder led Buck to the post, where his father used to tie the horses, looped the reins loosely, and stepped toward the door. Each footstep drew a groan from the wood. The smell inside was the same as old books left too long in a trunk, dust, decay, and something faintly sweet beneath it all, like the ghost of a meal long gone cold. He moved slow eyes, tracing the outlines of what used to be life. The hearth still sat crooked in the corner, filled with a nest of twigs and feathers. To the left, the stone counter where Clara had cooked was buried under a film of dirt so thick he could trace her shape through it with a finger. He touched the mark of an old nail on the beam above the kitchen, the spot where a pot had always hung, and for an instant he saw her again. Barefoot, humming sunlight in her hair. Then the vision faded, and all that remained was silence, and the faint hiss of wind through the gaps in the wall. The staircase had given up halfway steps, missing rails broken. He stared at it for a moment, then turned away. He could almost hear his father's boots on those same boards, and the man's deep voice calling daylight's burning sun. A smile ghosted across Calder's face. "You held on longer than I did," he whispered. Through the hole in the roof, a sliver of sun found its way inside, lighting the floating dust in gold. It fell across the warped floor like spilled memory, turning the ruined room into something sacred. He stood there until the light dimmed to amber and the air cooled around him, then wandered deeper into the house. He found the guitar hanging on the far wall right where it had always been. The strings were brown with rust, two snapped clean. The wood was cracked along the body, its varnish dulled to the color of ash. Calder reached for it, as if afraid it might crumble at his touch. It didn't. He lifted it down gently, brushing away the dust with his sleeve. The weight of it in his hands pulled something old and heavy from his chest. He sat at the table that leaned under its own age and plucked a string. The sound came out faint and uneven, barely music, more breath than tone, but it carried. He tried another, then another. The third one broke, curling away, with a soft twang that echoed through the hollow house. He laughed once, quiet and dry. "Guess you're about as tired as I am." When he tilted the guitar, the back panel came loose. Something slipped free and landed on the table with a soft thud. A folded piece of paper, edges yellowed and brittle with time. He stared at it a long moment before unfolding it. The handwriting was rough, faded by dust and sweat, but he knew it the instant he saw it, his father's hand. "If you ever come back, son, don't look for me. Look for what stayed alive." The words swam before his eyes. He read them again, slower this time, until they settled deep inside him. His father hadn't been talking about people. He'd been talking about the land, the pulse that never stopped, even when the rest of them did. The wind, the soil, the creatures too wild to die. He looked up at the ruined house, then around at the empty ranch, and felt something like understanding pass through him, quiet and certain as the evening light. "You knew, didn't you, old man?" he murmured. "Knew I'd come back trying to fix what wasn't broke." He ran a thumb over the last line until it smudged faintly, then folded the letter and tucked it inside his coat. Outside, the wind shifted. The boards creaked in rhythm, as if the house itself was breathing. Calder sat back in the broken chair, set the guitar across his knees, and strummed what strings remained. The sound was raw, out of tune, but it filled the air, one man and one dying home, making what music they could. "Guess I've been looking for the wrong things all my life," he said softly. His voice carried into the rafters, where it tangled with the whispering wind. Buck stood at the doorway, framed in the last glow of sunset. The horse's mane lifted gently in the breeze, his ears forward, eyes steady on his master. Calder turned toward him, half smiling. "This ain't just a visit, boy," he said. "It's the last ride." Buck shifted his weight, tail flicking, and took a slow step forward, enough to let the light fall fully into the room. Calder rose from the chair. His knees popped, the sound sharp in the silence. He rested a hand on the back of the guitar, then looked around one final time. The walls leaned and moaned, but they still stood. The air was thick with dust, but it was honest dust, the kind that came from things that had lived. He let his fingers trail across the doorframe, feeling the grooves worn smooth by decades of hands, his father's, his own, Clara's. Then he stepped outside. The sun was nearly gone. The horizon bled purple into red, the kind of color you only see once in a life, if you're lucky enough to come home for it. Buck snorted softly, and Calder rested his palm on the horse's neck. For a while, neither moved. The ranch lay silent around them, an old skeleton of memories, half buried in dust, waiting for someone to breathe through it again. The night settled over Dry Creek like a heavy blanket of ash. By the time Calder led Buck toward the old barn, the moon had climbed high, thin and pale, the color of worn bone. The barn stood crooked on its foundation, half a roof, missing its boards, warped and silvered by years of sun. The smell hit him first, dry hay rot, a ghost of horses long gone. One wall had caved inward, leaving a corner still standing firm enough to give shelter. That was good enough. He cleared a space with the toe of his boot, pushing aside brittle straw and broken timber. From a saddlebag, he pulled a small tin box and struck a match. The flare of light burned bright in the dark, catching on his lined face, and the hollows of his eyes. He fed the flame into a handful of kindling until it caught the smoke curling upward through the hole in the roof. The firelight painted the warped walls in trembling orange. Buck shifted beside him, breath steaming in the cold eyes, reflecting the light like small coins of amber. Calder spread his blanket and sat down close to the fire. The air was sharp, each breath edged with chill. He leaned back against Buck's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of the horse through his coat. The animal's side ribs rising and falling against his spine. For the first time since he'd come back, Calder felt something close to peace. The fire cracked a small comfort amid the ruin. Outside, the wind scraped across the plains, whistling through the gaps in the barn boards, carrying the faint smell of sage and dust. He spoke softly, half to himself, half to the land. "Don't reckon this place ever meant to be quiet." Buck flicked an ear. The wind answered with a low moan through the rafters. Calder smiled, watching the sparks leap upward, bright and brief, as memories before disappearing into the dark. He must have dozed, though he couldn't say for how long. When his eyes opened again, the fire had burned down to red coals, and the moonlight spilling through the holes in the roof was colder than before. At first, he thought it was the silence that woke him, too deep, too absolute. Then he heard it. A breath. Slow, heavy. Not his. Not Buck's. He held still his hand, instinctively finding the rifle beside him. The air inside the barn felt thick like a held breath. Another sound followed, a soft thud, deliberate, rhythmic. Hoof beats. They came from somewhere beyond the walls, faint at first, then clearer. A single horse, by the sound of it, walking the perimeter, slow and cautious. Buck's ears shot forward. His muscles tensed beneath Calder's palm. The old gelding gave a low rumble in his chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. Calder pushed himself upright, heart pounding slow and hard. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "Ghosts don't walk on four legs." Buck's nostrils flared. He snorted once, sharp and questioning. Outside, the steps stopped. The night hung still again. Then came another breath, drawn deep and shuddering from somewhere just beyond the half-collapsed door. Calder could almost feel it moving the air against his skin. The fire popped, sending up a startled spark. He waited, counting each of his own heartbeats, till the quiet settled back around them. For a long minute, he sat, frozen, listening. Nothing. Only the whisper of wind shifting the straw. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. When the sound didn't return, he reached for the lantern hanging by the post. It was an old kerosene thing, dented and cloudy, but it still worked. He lit the wick, shielding the flame with his hand, until it steadied, then pushed open the warped door. The hinges gave a tired groan. Outside, the world glowed silver. Moonlight pooled across the fields, turning the wild grass to pale glass. The air was so still, it felt like the whole valley was listening. Calder lifted the lantern high, its circle of light swaying across the ground. The dust shimmered like water. No movement, no shape, only emptiness stretching to the hills. Then as he turned, he saw them prints. Fresh ones. A line of hoof marks sunk deep into the soft earth, leading away from the barn and curving toward the far pasture. The edges still wet with dew. He crouched down, running his fingertips along the groove of one. The mud was cold but pliant, still holding the heat of a living body that had passed moments before. He straightened slowly, eyes scanning the distance. Somewhere out there, past the ridge of shadow, something shifted. A flicker of movement. Then the faintest sound, a low, rough whinny carried on the wind. Not the echo of Buck's breath, not memory. Real, alive. It came once brief and hoarse before the night swallowed it whole. Behind him, Buck answered an instinctive resonant cry that rolled through the valley and faded into the hills. The sound was both challenge and greeting. Calder felt the hair rise on his arms. He turned the lantern slowly, searching the dark, but whatever had been there was gone. Only the whisper of grass moving in the breeze remained. He chuckled under his breath, though there was no humor in it. "Ain't no one here but ghosts," he muttered, eyes still on the pasture. "Unless the ghosts got hooves." The wind shifted again, brushing against his coat, carrying the smell of rain that would never fall. For a heartbeat, he thought he heard another step far off. A single clop, then silence. He went back inside, closing the door behind him. The latch no longer caught, so he wedged a loose board against it. The fire had dwindled to embers faint orange, breathing in the dark. He sat down beside it, and the lantern dimming low, and Buck settled close, curling one hind leg under. Calder kept the rifle across his knees, though he doubted steel meant much against whatever roamed the night. The barn creaked around them, timbers sighing in rhythm with the wind. The light threw their shadows long across the planks, one man, one horse, two stubborn silhouettes against time. Calder watched the door for a while, waiting for movement that never came. Outside, the valley slept. He let the rifle rest, rub the back of his neck. Every sound out here had a way of turning itself into something else. Wind became whispers. Whispers became footsteps. Footsteps became memories, walking around in circles. He looked toward Buck, whose head had lowered near the fire, eyelids drooping, but ears still twitching to every creak. Calder smiled faintly. "Reckon we ain't alone, old boy." But then never were we? The horse exhaled a soft gust that stirred the ash. The glow lit the lines of Calder's face, worn, wind-cut, half hidden by the brim of his hat. He set the lantern beside him, letting its light mingle with the coals, and stretched out on the blanket. The floor was cold, but it felt solid beneath him. Something to trust. He closed his eyes, yet his mind stayed awake, wandering through the dark. Somewhere in the edges of sleep, he thought he heard the faint rhythm again, hooves distant, steady moving, not away, but around. Like something circling, guarding. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks, but deep down, he knew better. The land had memory, and sometimes memory walked after midnight. He breathed in the scent of smoke and old hay, felt Buck's slow heartbeat through the ground, and whispered to no one. Maybe it's the land remembering itself, through what's left to walk on it. The words drifted away like smoke, curling into the rafters, into the night beyond. Outside, the breeze picked up again, carrying with it that same hollow echo, half wind, half hoofbeats rolling softly through the valley, until it faded into silence. Calder slept at last, and the lantern's flame, dwindling to a pale eye that blinked once then went dark. Dawn crept slowly over Dry Creek. The first light of day came thin and golden, seeping through the holes in the barn roof like spilled honey. Smoke from the night's fire still hung in the air, a faint blue haze that caught the sunlight and drifted upward, smelling of burnt pine and cold ash. The straw beneath Calder crackled when he stirred. His back ached, his hands were stiff, and the chill of the night clung to his bones. Beside him, Buck stood quietly, head bent toward a pile of old hay, chewing with slow contentment. The horse's breath made soft white ghosts in the cold air. Calder sat up, rubbed his eyes, and listened. The silence had weight. It wasn't the emptiness of death, but the kind that follows something unseen, like the hush after a storm, when the land itself pauses to take stock of what remains. He reached out and laid a palm against Buck's neck. "Mornin', old boy," he murmured. "Guess we made it through another one." The horse flicked an ear, still chewing. A beam of sunlight cut through the barn's broken boards, stretching across the floor until it brushed Calder's boots. Dust danced within it, bright and alive, and he found himself smiling faintly. The world outside was waking, and for the first time in years, he wanted to see what it looked like. He pushed open the door, the hinges squealing in protest. The air outside was crisp, heavy with dew, and the smell of wet sage. A thin mist clung to the ground, silver in the rising sun. Beyond the yard, the fields lay quiet under a veil of pale light. It might have been peaceful if not for what he saw in the dirt. At first, he thought they were his own tracks from the night before. Then he saw more of them, crossing, circling, overlapping in patterns too fresh to be ghosts of the past. Hoof prints. Dozens of them pressed into the soft earth near the fence line. The ground still held their shape, the edges dark with moisture. He knelt, brushing his fingers across one. The soil was damp, faintly warm from the heat of something recently alive. Nearby, a patch of grass had been bitten down, the blades torn short and wet. He leaned closer, saw what he couldn't mistake, fresh droppings still glistening with morning dew. A breath escaped him, half disbelief, half wonder. Someone's been living here all along. He rose slowly, scanning the yard. The fence was splintered in places, but between the gaps he could see a faint trail leading away, hoof marks, weaving through tufts of wild grass, crossing toward the open range behind the barn. He followed boots, sinking slightly in the softened earth eyes, tracing every impression, like reading the pages of a story written overnight. Each print seemed to speak of movement, of purpose. He could almost picture them, the herd moving under moonlight shadows, slipping across the pasture alive and free, where he'd thought only silence remained. The trail curved along the fence and disappeared over a rise. He stopped at the top of the small hill, the ranch spread out behind him. Broken house, sagging barn, the ghost of a windmill turning slow in the breeze. Before him stretched the back meadow, pale gold, under the lifting fog. For a moment, he simply stood there, breathing it in. The land didn't look dead anymore. It looked waiting. Buck's sudden snort broke the stillness. The horse had followed, ears pricked, nostrils flaring as if catching a scent. Then, without warning, he raised his head high and gave a deep, rolling whinny that echoed through the valley. The sound carried far, bouncing off the low hills and fading into the mist. From the other side of the field, an answer came. Faint at first, then clear, a single strong reply, sharp as an arrow splitting air. Calder froze, his heart thudding once against his ribs. He turned toward the sound. Through the thinning fog, a figure emerged. At first, it was only a shadow, something moving with the rhythm of wind and grace. Then the light shifted, and he saw it fully. A horse stood on the far edge of the meadow. Its coat was a deep burnished chestnut that caught the dawn like copper fire. A long white mane ran the length of its neck, glowing pale against the darker body. It held its head-high muscles, taut beneath the skin eyes, dark and watchful. Even from that distance, Calder could see the intelligence there, the same wild spark that once burned in Buck's younger eyes. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. The stranger didn't move. It stood facing them, ears forward, steam curling from its nostrils. The world seemed to narrow until there was only the two of them, one horse born of age and memory, one shaped by time and freedom. Buck took a step forward and gave a low, uncertain nicker. The other answered with a sharp whinny that rolled across the grass. Then silence again. Calder felt something twist deep inside him. Recognition, awe, maybe even guilt. He whispered, "You've got his blood in you, don't you?" The horse flicked its tail, stamping once as if to answer. Then, as the sun broke fully over the ridge, turning the fog to gold, it wheeled around and galloped away up the hill through the tall grass, vanishing into the light. Only the sound of its hooves lingered, fading into the distance, like a heartbeat swallowed by wind. Calder stood there long after it was gone. Buck lowered his head, pawing the ground softly. The old man reached out and touched the gelding's muzzle. "Ain't just us, boy," he said quietly. Never was. He walked the field for another hour, tracing the network of prints that spidered out across the land. Some were small foals, maybe. Others deep and wide, the mark of strong adults. Where the grass had been trampled, fresh shoots were already trying to rise again. It wasn't ruin anymore. It was renewal. The words from his father's letter came back to him, the ink faded, but the meaning sharp. "If you ever come back, son, don't look for me. Look for what stayed alive." He understood it now. His father hadn't meant memories or ghosts. He'd meant this, the persistence of life in the soil, the animals that carried the ranch's spirit, even when the house fell to rot. Calder closed his eyes, feeling the sun warm his face. "Guess I just found it," he murmured. He thought about all the years he'd spent believing the place was dead, thinking his leaving had killed it. But the land hadn't needed him to survive. It had found its own way. That realization didn't sting, it soothed. It meant the ranch had never really belonged to him or even to his family. It had only ever loaned itself to them for a time, as the earth loans its breath to all living things. The sun was already climbing when Calder tightened the strap on his saddle. The memory of the chestnut stallion, its white mane cutting through the fog, still burned behind his eyes. He couldn't shake it. The hoof prints in the soft earth outside the barn seemed to lead somewhere, and something in his chest insisted he follow. He touched Buck's neck. "Easy, boy. We're close. I can feel it." Buck's ears twitched, catching the heat already rising from the ground. The morning cool was gone. The air shimmered with a dried light that smelled of dust and warm stone. They moved slow at first, the old horse steady on uneven ground. The ranch fell behind them, house, barn, and windmill, shrinking to silhouettes against the haze. Ahead lay miles of open country, bleached and wavering beneath the noon glare. The tracks cut through a line of broken fencing and the same corral his father had once mended with wire and prayer. Calder ducked beneath it, boots scuffing against the post. Everywhere he looked, the land seemed caught between ruin and endurance, cactus blossoms splitting through rock weeds, reclaiming the troughs, grass growing where hooves had pounded decades ago. The sun beat down on his shoulders, each breath tasting of iron and sage. They climbed a low rise. Beyond it spread a hollow valley. He remembered only from stories the stone meadow, a bowl of pale rock and knee-high grass, where his father used to turn the herd loose after branding. The hoof marks led straight toward it, clear and unhurried, as though whatever had left them had known exactly where it was going. Calder stopped at the crest, wiped sweat from his brow, and squinted through the glare. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw nothing but heat shimmer. Then the earth moved. Down in the valley, the grass rippled like water. Out of that motion came shapes, 7, maybe 8 horses scattered across the open floor, grazing among the yellow waves. A few lifted their heads, tails flicking lazily. 2 younger ones broke into a playful run, circling the others in bursts of dust. Their coats flashed in the sun, browns, grays, whites, a palette he recognized too well. Every color carried a ghost of memory. The dapple gray his father had prized, the sorrel mare Clara had named after spring rain. Calder froze where he stood. For 20 years he had imagined this place empty, stripped of all heartbeat. Now it pulsed with life. The herd didn't scatter. They watched him from below, still and curious ears tilting to catch the sound of wind. Buck shifted behind him, but made no move forward. The two of them simply stared, man and horse, at the living proof that the past had not burned away. Calder let the breeze roll off the ridge before he spoke. "So, you never left, huh?" The words barely carried. He didn't dare raise his voice, afraid the sound might break the spell. The herd breathed as one sunlight glinting off their backs, the smell of them faint, even from here, sweet, raw, unmistakably alive. Buck answered with a low nicker, deep and even. Across the valley, one of the mares tossed her head and called back a soft, throaty sound that drifted upward like the echo of a memory too stubborn to die. Calder's throat tightened. He felt the sting of tears before he could stop them. He led Buck down the slope slowly, careful not to startle the herd. Halfway down, he stopped again and let his eyes adjust to the bright. Among the group stood a stallion, apart from the rest, tall, broad-chested, the sun striking a white blaze down its face. For an instant, Calder's knees went weak. That mark, he'd seen it before. Decades ago, on a horse named Stormlight, the pride of the Hayes Ranch, bred from the finest stock his father ever owned. He swallowed hard. Well, I'll be damned. The resemblance was uncanny, the same proud neck, the same quick, intelligent eyes. Even the way the wind caught the tail felt familiar. But this creature was no tamed beauty. Its coat bore scars. Its mane was thick with burrs. Its muscles were lean from running wild, a survivor's build. Calder watched in silence, taking in the rest of them, mares heavy with foal. A few younger stallions hovering at the edges, testing their strength. Every line of their bodies, every flick of an ear spoke of heritage older than fences. He could almost trace the generations backward through drought and storm, back to the corral where his father had once whistled to them at dawn. His chest ached with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. He looked down at Buck, whose breath came slow and even. "They didn't need us," Calder whispered. "That's why they made it." Buck lowered his head tail, swishing once, as if in quiet agreement. The old horse understood. They had spent years surviving without purpose, while this herd had found its own way, guided by wind, by instinct, by the same stubborn will that had built this land long before men thought they owned it. Calder blinked the salt from his eyes. In the distance, the stallion lifted its head again, mane rippling like flame. The sight filled him with something he hadn't felt since Clara's laughter filled the porch. Peace laced with the pain of knowing he no longer belonged to what he loved most. A gust rose from the west, sweeping across the valley. It bent the tall grass in waves, turning sunlight to shifting gold. Dust spiraled upward, wrapping the herd in a halo of motion. They began to move together, not fleeing, not frightened, simply running for the joy of it. Hooves struck rhythm against the earth, each beat a drum of memory. Calder closed his eyes and listened. The sound was music, wild and perfect. He could hear chords beneath it, his father's old guitar drifting from the porch, Clara humming along while supper simmered. He could almost smell the stew, feel the heat of the hearth, hear the laughter that once made this valley a home. For a moment, all time folded into itself, the living and the dead, the man and the boy he used to be, the breath of the land, filling every empty space between. He opened his eyes. The herd was already far across the valley, manes streaming bodies glinting in the sun like shards of wind-made silver. He watched until they blurred into the horizon, until movement and air became the same thing. A smile touched his lips, small and honest. "You belong to the wind all along," he whispered. The wind answered with another rush, stronger this time, lifting his hat brim and stinging his eyes with grit. He laughed quietly, wiping at his face, half believing it was the land itself laughing back. When the valley stilled again, he stood for a long time with his hands resting on Buck's neck. The old horse was breathing hard from the climb sides, rising and falling. Calder felt the tremor under his palm-age exhaustion, but also calm acceptance. The same acceptance stirring in his own bones. "We ain't taking nothing back, boy," he said softly. "We just keep watch." Buck turned his head slightly, one dark eye catching the light. It wasn't obedience in that look, it was understanding. Calder gazed once more across the meadow. The herd had vanished beyond the ridge, but their presence lingered, the scent, the prints, the rhythm of hooves still echoing inside his chest. It started as whispers over morning coffee. A week had passed since Calder Hayes had found the herd, and the town of Tumbleweed Ridge was already stirring with stories. Inside the Rusty Spur Cafe, the regulars leaned over chipped mugs, voices low but eager. "Old Hayes is back on that ghost ranch. Heard he's living with a bunch of wild horses out there." Laughter followed, dry and knowing. Someone said he'd lost his mind. Someone else swore they'd seen horses running the ridge at dawn, manes flashing like silver. No one agreed on much except that it was strange, and strange things had always clung to the name Hayes. At the corner table, Sheriff Darrell Hodge listened in silence, his cup cooling in his hand. He'd known Calder since they were boys, rode fence together, broke colts, fought in the same rodeo circuits. The man had always been part dust and part stubbornness. When he left 20 years ago, Darrell figured he'd never see him again. Now, hearing that Hayes had returned to a place everyone else had written off, the sheriff couldn't tell if it was madness or something holier. He set his cup down and sighed. "Guess some ghosts don't know when to stay dead," he muttered. He fetched his hat and told his deputy he'd be gone till sundown. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, a man gone senile or a legend shaking the dust off its boots. Either way, he had to see it for himself. The road out to Three Winds Ranch was the same as ever, long, cracked, and lonely. The noon sun bled white over the plains, heat shimmer turning the horizon to glass. Darrell rode an old chestnut mare named Daisy, her breath huffing against the dry wind. He carried 2 tin cups and a thermos of coffee in his saddlebag, out of habit more than hope. There'd been a time decades ago when he and Calder had spent entire mornings like this, 2 young cowboys riding the boundary lines, trading stories, believing the world could still be mended if you had enough fence wire and daylight. The air smelled of sage and iron. When he crested the last hill, the ranch came into view, half ruin, half resurrection. The house still sagged, but the barn's roof looked patched, and the water trough glinted with fresh nails. Even the old gate had been braced upright with new planks. Hayes 1887. The letters caught the sun like burnished scars. At the far end of the yard, Calder was bent over the trough, tightening a bolt with slow, steady turns. Buck stood nearby, tail flicking lazily at flies. Darrell reined in, boots creaking in the stirrups. "You still chasing ghosts?" Hayes Calder looked up, sweat shining on his weathered face. He smiled faintly, eyes narrowing against the light. "No. I found him. Turns out they're still breathing." The sheriff barked a short laugh, shaking his head. He dismounted, pulled the coffee from his saddlebag, and poured 2 cups. The smell rose between them, bitter, comforting, familiar as the years they'd both outlived. Neither said much for a while. The wind carried the sound of creaking boards and a distant whinny. It was the kind of silence only old friends could share, full of things better left unspoken. They sat on the front steps, steam curling from the mugs. The boards beneath them were gray with age, but solid underfoot. Beyond the yard stretched the open range, shimmering under the hard sky. Darrell took a slow sip, eyes sweeping the horizon. The place looked both dead and alive, fences falling and weeds pushing through cracks, yet the faint noise of movement carried from somewhere beyond the barn. He tilted his head. You telling me there's really horses out here? After all this time, Calder poured another inch of coffee into his own cup. Go take a look for yourself. The sheriff stood curiosity edging past doubt. He walked around the barn boots, crunching over dry grass. At first, he saw nothing but sun and dust. Then, as he stepped beyond the last post, his breath caught. A herd grazed in the far field, sleek, wild, utterly real. 8 of them, maybe more. Their coats gleamed in the light muscles rippling under skin that looked carved from earth and wind. Foals darted between the mares, kicking up little clouds of gold dust. One stallion, taller than the rest, raised its head and looked straight at him. Not afraid, just aware. Darrell stood rooted, hat in hand, the air gone from his lungs. For a long moment he couldn't speak. The wind moved through the grass, and the herd shifted with it, graceful as a tide. He whispered, "Hell. Maybe the land does keep what it loves." When he finally returned to the porch, Calder was still sitting there, watching him over the rim of his cup. The sheriff's face said everything. Calder smiled, the quiet, tired smile of a man who'd finally heard the world answer him back. "You ain't crazy, Hayes," Darrell said softly. "Just late to your own story." Calder chuckled. "Took me long enough to find the ending." They drank in silence after that, watching the wind ripple through the fields. The herd moved farther off their shapes, blurring in the heat, until only the echo of their hooves remained. When the coffee was gone, the sheriff packed up and walked back to his horse. The sun was starting to dip, throwing long shadows over the yard. He paused one hand on the saddle horn and looked back. "You gonna stay here till it takes you?" he asked. Calder nodded, standing beside Buck, one hand resting on the horse's mane. "Reckon that's the plan. Somebody's got to keep the wind company." Darrell smiled faintly. "Then I'll make sure nobody bothers you, or them." They clasped hands, rough, calloused, strong despite the years. No more words needed. It felt like goodbye, though neither said it. When Darrell swung into the saddle, Calder raised 2 fingers in a small salute. The sheriff tipped his hat, then turned his horse toward the horizon. The ride back to town was long and red with dust. Behind him, the ranch faded into the distance, in the setting sun catching on the tin roof like a final flare of fire. He didn't look back again. Some stories weren't meant to be followed. They were meant to be left alone to finish themselves. By the next morning, Tumbleweed Ridge was alive with new talk. This time there was no laughter. Sheriff saw it himself, the Hayes herds still alive. Said he rode out there and saw the old man feeding him. Maybe that land's got something sacred in it. The rumors spread like wind through dry grass, across the diner, the feed store, even as far as the post office in Dry Creek. People who'd once sworn the Hayes Ranch was cursed now whispered it was blessed. Some said the horses were descendants of the old Hayes line. Others that they were spirits guarding their master's grave before he even lay in it. By sundown, the phrase, "The Hayes horses never died," was scrawled on a napkin pinned above the saloon's register. Every man who read it nodded quietly, as if that truth had always been waiting. Out at the ranch, Calder knew nothing of the talk, or if he did, he didn't care. He spent his days the same way he had, since returning, mending fences, patching what little could still hold, watching the herd roam free through the heat haze. Sometimes, the stallion would appear on a nearby ridge mane, rippling like a banner, eyes fixed on him from afar. Calder would lift his hat in greeting, and the horse would toss its head, as if acknowledging the gesture of an equal. In the evenings when the sky burned orange and purple, he'd sit beside Buck with a tin cup of coffee and listen to the wind. The sound of hooves sometimes rolled faintly from the distance, soft, steady, like the heartbeat of the land itself. He didn't try to follow it anymore. He didn't need to. The knowing was enough. He reached over, patting Buck's neck. "They'll be all right," he said quietly, "long as we keep watch." The horse flicked his tail, breathing deep. The air smelled of grass and dust of life, still clinging to the bones of old things. Far off, thunder grumbled beyond the ridge, a promise of weather maybe, or just the sky remembering how to speak. Calder smiled faintly. Whatever came next, he was home. The afternoon sky burned the color of copper. The sun hung low over Dry Creek, a molten coin pressed against the horizon. The heat carried a strange edge, metallic sharp, the kind that crawled under the skin before the storm came. Calder Hayes was mending fence when it started the hammer. Slow in his hand, his breath steady but shallow. The air had gone still. Even the cicadas had gone quiet. Then the wind shifted. It came first from the west, hot and dry. Then it turned south, harder, meaner, dragging with it the smell of dust and iron. Buck lifted his head from the brittle grass, ears flicking, nostrils flaring wide. The horse's body tightened under the tension of instinct. Calder straightened, shading his eyes with one hand. Out there, far beyond the ridge, the sky had turned wrong. A wall of dust, vast and heaving, rolled across the plain, rising high enough to swallow the sun. Light bled through it in strange hues, gold rust and the deep, angry red of old wounds. It shimmered like a living thing, hungry and patient. The sound reached him a moment later, low and steady like thunder wrapped in breath. He froze. For a heartbeat, the years fell away. He saw it again 20 years back. The night Clara died, the same sky, the same smell. He'd run then. Left the ranch behind because the storm had taken everything that mattered. Now it was coming again. Dry Creek's breathing again, he murmured. Same as that night. Buck snorted, restless, stamping the ground. The wind picked up another notch, rattling the wire fence like bones. Calder stared at the coming storm and felt the weight of every mile he'd ever ridden settle into his chest. Not this time. He worked fast, moving with the sharp efficiency of someone who'd learned the hard way. The first gusts tore across the field, lifting sand in swirling sheets. By the time he reached the barn, the air already stung his eyes. He could taste grit on his tongue. "Easy, Buck," he said, pulling at the reins. "We gotta get him in." The herd was scattered across the lower pasture, restless heads tossing in alarm. Calder unlatched the corral gate and whistled low. The sound barely carried in the wind, but the stallion heard the one with the white blaze. It turned toward him, muscles tight with confusion. "Come on," Calder shouted, waving his hat. He moved like a man possessed, herding the stragglers toward the old stone barn, the only structure still strong enough to hold. Buck circled the edge of the herd, his movement sure, despite the years driving the mares and foals inward. They obeyed, frightened but trusting, as if some buried memory in their blood still recognized the call of the Hayes line. The sky had turned the color of rusted steel. The wind howled, pushing the air sideways. Calder forced the heavy doors open, the hinges screaming. One by one, the horses filed in, 8, 9, 10, their bodies pressing against each other for warmth and safety. He slammed the gate behind them, then wrestled an old oil tarp across the entrance, tying it down with rope. Dust already swirled in eddies inside the barn. The air was thick enough to choke. Calder tied a cloth around his mouth, checked every latch twice, and braced the weak spots with timber. His lungs burned, but his hands kept moving. He glanced toward the open sky. Once more, the horizon was gone. Only the storm now rolling closer, swallowing everything in its path. The sound was deafening, a roar, like 100 trains made of sand and wind. He looked at Buck. The horse's mane whipped sideways, eyes bright with fear but steady. Calder nodded. "Not this time. We ain't running again." The first blast hit like a slap from God. Sand sharp as glass slammed against the barn's walls. The structure groaned, every nail and beam protesting. Dust poured through the cracks, turning daylight into a dull red haze. Calder threw his weight against the door, pressing the tarp tighter as the wind clawed at it. The pressure was immense, as if the whole desert had decided to climb inside. Behind him, the horses screamed, hooves pounding the dirt. "Hold on, Buck, keep him steady." Buck moved without hesitation, circling the herd, his voice carrying through the chaos. Each cry from him steadied the others. The foals huddled together, the mares lowered their heads. The sound of their breathing filled the storm's brief pauses, like the pulse of a living heart. Then came another impact, harder. A beam snapped somewhere overhead, the roof shaking loose in a shower of splinters. Cascades of sand spilled through the gaps. Calder coughed, eyes watering, lungs raw. He stumbled toward the collapsing section and braced it with his shoulder pushing back against the storm's invisible weight. Every muscle screamed. The wind tore at his coat, flinging it open like wings. Outside there was no horizon, no sky, only a vast, moving wall of dust that glowed from within, like a furnace. It howled through the gaps with voices that sounded almost human, crying, screaming mourning. The land itself was angry, reclaiming what little was left of its breath. Night fell, though it was impossible to tell when. The world had turned red-black. Lightning flickered inside the storm clouds, each flash revealing the shape of Calder's struggle. A man framed in the doorway, bent but unbroken. He had tied a rope around his waist and the main post anchoring himself in case the wind tried to drag him away. His hands bled from splinters. His lips cracked under the grit. "Come on, you bastard," he growled at the storm. "I've stood longer than you before." A plank tore loose and slammed against his shoulder. He staggered but didn't fall. Behind him, Buck neighed sharply, a sound half fury, half command. The stallion with the white blaze answered from inside the herd, calling the others into a tight circle. Hooves stamped in rhythm. The barn shook, but the rhythm held. Calder felt it, the beat of the herd, the defiance of life itself. The sound merged with his heartbeat, with the roar outside, until everything became one pulse, one voice, refusing to yield. He thought of Clara, then her laughter, her hair tangled in the wind, her voice that night when the dust had come before. She'd been sick, coughing blood, and he'd run to fetch help. But the storm had buried the road, buried everything. By the time he returned, she was gone. The land had taken her the same way it was trying to take him now. Rage and sorrow broke loose in him, sharp as the grit that tore his throat. He screamed into the storm, "You took her once, not again. Not this time." The words were ripped from his mouth, carried into the howling void, yet somehow the storm seemed to hear. Lightning tore open the sky, white and brutal, freezing the world for an instant. The flash lit his face, streaked with blood, and dust, eyes burning with something fierce and human. Buck reared beside him, mane thrashing like fire. Calder reached for him, hand pressed against the horse's neck, grounding himself in the heat of another heartbeat. Together, they stood in that doorway, the storm slamming around them like the wrath of gods. Sand burned against his skin, and still, he didn't move. He was done running. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no meaning inside the storm. The barn's frame trembled, the roof half gone. Coughing, gasping, Calder clung to the beam, the rope digging into his waist. His body screamed for rest, but something deeper than will kept him upright. It wasn't courage, it was promise. The first light of day, broke weakly through the veil of red dust. The sun, pale and uncertain, hung low over Three Winds Ranch, its rays cutting through the air. like thin blades of gold. All around the world seemed frozen in a breath between ruin and renewal. The storm had passed. What it left behind looked less like a ranch and more like the skeleton of one. The roof of the stone barn had caved halfway. Splintered boards jutted from the earth like bones. The windmill lay twisted in the field, and what had once been pasture was now a field of ash-colored grass singed at the edges. Every surface wore a fine layer of dust, red as rust, soft as powder. When the wind stirred, it rose like smoke from an invisible battlefield. The sound of the storm was gone, replaced by something smaller. The occasional creak of wood, the patter of falling grit, the whisper of wind sifting through broken beams. The air smelled of iron and wet clay, of something burnt and something newly born. It was the smell of endings and beginnings pressed together. Against the far wall of the barn lay Calder Hayes. He was still half buried under a drift of sand, his coat torn open and his hair streaked gray and crimson. Beside him, Buck lay collapsed on his flanked chest, rising in slow, shallow heaves. The horse's mane was matted with dust. One eye blinked sluggishly against the glare. Calder's right hand rested on Buck's neck, fingers curled as if he had fallen asleep guarding him. For a long while, there was no movement between them, only the soft sigh of the wind winding through the ruins. Then Calder coughed a dry, scraping sound, and his shoulders twitched. The movement stirred a small cloud of red dust that shimmered briefly in the sun. He opened his eyes. The light was blinding, fractured through the haze. Every muscle in his body screamed, and the taste of grit filled his mouth. He turned his head, saw Buck's still form beside him, and for an instant thought the horse was gone. Then he felt the faint vibration of breath beneath his palm. A cracked smile touched his lips. "Still here, huh, old boy?" Buck stirred his tail, flicking weakly. He let out a faint, tired groan, half sigh, half answer. Calder chuckled, though it came out more like a wheeze. "You and me both. Guess the wind ain't done with us yet." He tried to sit up, managed only halfway before pain clamped down along his ribs. He stayed where he was, breathing slow, watching the sunlight creep over the ruins, like a cautious visitor. From somewhere deep within the stone barn came a sound, faint but alive. A shuffle, a snort, then another. Calder turned his head toward it, hardly daring to believe. Out from the shadows stepped the first of them, a mare, her coat streaked with red dust, mane tangled, eyes wide but bright. She moved slowly, testing the ground, the sunlight catching on her flanks. Behind her came another, and then another, until the opening of the barn filled with movement. The herd emerged into the morning, one by one. Foals pressed close to their mothers, trembling slightly. A stallion limped forward, his sides caked with dirt, but his head held high. Their coats were dull, their bodies worn, but they were breathing, alive. They stood there, blinking against the light, as if unsure whether the world outside still existed. The air around them glittered with motes of dust that turned gold in the sun. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Calder struggled to his knees, bracing one hand against the ground. His chest burned, but his eyes were clear now. He looked at the herd, at the miracle of them standing there, and felt something crack open inside him. Something old and tight that had lived there for 20 years. "You stubborn sons of wind," he whispered, voice trembling. "You made it." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Buck lifted his head, the old horse's nostrils flaring. He gave a low, rasping neigh. The herd answered as one, a chorus of sharp, bright cries that rose into the morning air and rolled out across the valley. The sound echoed off the stone hills, wild and pure, as if the earth itself were singing through them. Calder laughed through tears. He wiped at his face, but the motion only smeared more red across his skin. The light caught on his tears, turning them into small flecks of gold. He looked at Buck, who was now pushing himself shakily to his feet. The old gelding stood swaying head high, eyes fixed on the herd. Calder reached out and pressed a hand to his shoulder. "Easy now," he murmured. "We did what we came for." The horse breathed out through his nose a soft, tired sound that carried a weight of understanding. The sun climbed higher, turning the dust in the air into a golden fog. The horses spread out into the yard, cautious at first, then bolder their hooves, leaving faint prints in the red sand. A foal nudged its mother's side, eager for milk. Two of the younger mares rolled in the dirt, shaking free the remnants of the storm. The stallion stepped forward, head high, nostrils flaring, as he surveyed the horizon. He turned once toward Calder, a long, still moment, and then looked away, as though acknowledging a fellow survivor. The silence was alive again. Not the hollow quiet of death, but the full, heavy stillness that follows struggle. Calder could hear the wind shifting through the grass, the faint rustle of wings as a hawk circled overhead. The land smelled clean, now washed of fury. It was broken, yes, but breathing. He let his gaze wander across the wreckage, the collapsed roof, the fallen fence, the charred timbers of the porch. All gone. And yet, around every scar of ruin, life was already reclaiming space grass, poking through the cracks, a glint of green against all the red. He felt the weight of understanding settle on him, not heavy but peaceful. "Guess that's the truth of it," he murmured. "The house dies, the land don't." He drew in a slow breath, tasting dust and sunlight. "I kept it, Pa," he said softly. "The land's still breathing." The words drifted into the wind, like a prayer, half to his father, half to Clara, half to the ground beneath him. In his mind, he could almost hear them answer his father's steady voice, his wife's laughter carried in the whispering air. He looked toward the herd again. They were standing in a line now facing east, where the first full strength of morning lit the valley. The light painted their coats in shades of copper and gold so bright it hurt to look at them. Buck stood beside them, his head lifted, mane stirring gently in the breeze. For the first time in years, Calder saw no difference between them and him. They were all part of the same pulse, earth breath and memory. The breeze strengthened, tugging softly at his torn coat. Dust rose and swirled around him in tiny spirals, glittering like embers. It clung to his hair and beard, to the folds of Buck's mane, to the air itself, turning the world to gold. He leaned back against the cracked wall, closing his eyes. Every breath hurt, but it was a clean hurt, honest and earned. 3 days passed after the storm. No wind, no thunder, no creak of collapsing wood, only the vast, reverent silence that follows survival. The world around Three Winds Ranch had turned to still life. The ground was blanketed in a fine red dust that shimmered under the afternoon sun, soft as ash. The fences were gone, the barn a skeleton of stone and splinters, the air holding that faint metallic scent of rain that never came. When the wind moved, and it rarely did, it stirred just enough dust to glint in the light like the slow drift of snow. It was the kind of quiet that asked for no reply, only breath, only presence. Calder sat inside what was left of the stone barn. He had pulled a wooden crate into the doorway, using it as a seat, and from there he watched the valley. The herd was scattered now, grazing in 2s and 3s across the low hills, but every so often one would wander back toward the barn, as if to check on him. Each time they did, he would lift his hat in silent greeting. They never stayed long. Freedom had claimed them, as it should. Beside him stood Buck, the old gelding, The horse's ribs showed faintly under the dust, but his eyes were calm, steady, unafraid. His breath came slower these days, yet each exhale was warm, a live reel. Calder reached up, brushing his fingers through the coarse mane, feeling the familiar strength beneath the age. There was nothing left to repair, nothing left to lose. Only time and the quiet grace of farewell. He spent the next hours searching through the debris until he found what he wanted, a sheet of crumpled paper creased and half-yellowed, and a short pencil worn nearly to its stub. He carried them to the table, the same rough plank of wood that had survived the storm, though the roof above it hadn't. Its surface was split and scarred, darkened by age and weather, but it was still standing. Like him. He sat down and began to write, slow and deliberate, every stroke heavy with effort. His hand trembled slightly, but his mind was clear. The words came from somewhere deep, the same place prayers are born, when there's no one left to hear them. These horses ain't mine no more. Let them roam. The land remembers who they are. He paused, staring at the words, until the lines blurred, then signed simply beneath. C. Hayes, 3 Winds Ranch. When it was done, he folded the paper, once laid it flat on the table, and placed a small stone over the top to keep the wind from taking it. Beside it sat the old guitar strings, broken wood split, and the letter his father had left him decades before. They lay there together, 2 relics of what had come before, 2 voices of the past. His gaze drifted to his father's faded handwriting. Don't look for me. Look for what stayed alive. Calder smiled faintly. Found it, Pa, he whispered. It's breathing out there. The sound of his voice was soft, barely carried by the air. Buck turned his head toward him, one ear flicking, and let out a quiet whicker as if acknowledging that this, at last, was the end of the trail. By late afternoon, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the ridgeline, bleeding gold across the valley. Calder rose from the table, folded the letter from his father into the worn leather pouch he kept at his side, and took one long look around the barn. There was peace here now, the kind that didn't need walls or roofs. The storm had stripped everything bare, and what remained was honest. He touched the door frame as he passed the wood still warm from sunlight. You did all right, he murmured to the ruins. Held longer than anyone thought. Buck stood waiting just outside, already saddled. The old horse lifted his head when Calder approached, dark eyes glinting in the late light. Calder moved slowly, easing the saddle strap one last time, patting the worn leather like a handshake. He slipped his boot into the stirrup, pulling himself up with a groan that was half pain, half satisfaction. Easy now, he said, breath-catching. Just one more ride. They set off at a walk. No hurry, no reason for speed. The sun hung low and wide, painting everything in shades of fire. The grass along the trail was coated in red dust that shimmered gold with each step. Somewhere a hawk cried overhead, a long, lonesome sound that carried across the valley like farewell. They crossed the ridge following the faint outline of an old trail half buried by time. The land seemed to open before them, gentle and vast. Calder could see the cypress tree from here, tall, dark, and ancient, standing alone on the hill where his father had once buried Stormlight, the first Hayes stallion. The sight of it filled his chest with warmth. The air smelled of earth and sunlight. Wind brushed through Buck's mane, whispering like an old friend. When they reached the hill, Calder dismounted, legs unsteady but sure. He walked the last few yards on foot, one hand on Buck's reins, the other trailing along the rough bark of the old tree. It had weathered more storms than he could count. Its roots had drunk the same rain that once fell on his father's hands. He laid his palm against the trunk. The bark was cool, alive. "You did good, old boy," he said softly. "Guess it's time to rest." Buck's breath warmed his shoulder. The horse nudged him gently, pressing his head against Calder's arm. The gesture nearly undid him. He rested his forehead against the horse's neck eyes, closing, letting the silence fold around them both. The sun was dropping fast now, its light deepening to copper. Calder eased himself down at the base of the cypress, the earth soft beneath him. He leaned back, legs stretched out the horizon before him, aflame with color. Below in the valley, the herd had gathered, tiny moving shapes, kicking up little clouds of dust as they ran. Alive. Free. He smiled, weary, but full. "We kept it alive," he whispered. "That's enough." Buck stood nearby, his silhouette outlined in the firelight. Calder reached into his pocket, pulled out a rag, and wiped at the dirt streaking the horse's muzzle. The touch was tender, almost fatherly. "You did good, partner," he said. "Real good." The horse lowered himself carefully to the ground beside him, folding his legs with slow grace until his body pressed close to Calder's. The air between them was warm, humming with the faint rhythm of shared breath. Above them, the sky burned orange, then crimson, then a kind of molten gold. Clouds stretched thin across the horizon like brushstrokes of smoke. The last light of day glowed against their skin, their coats, their breath. Calder felt the world begin to fade at the edges, not in pain, but in peace. He rested his hand on Buck's neck, feeling the pulse there strong and steady. "Home, boy," he murmured, eyes heavy. "We're home." As the sun slid beneath the ridge, the valley fell into shadow. Only the sound of the wind remained soft, endless, carrying through the grass and around the cypress like a lullaby. It whispered through the branches down the hill across the bones of the ranch. It was the sound of the land breathing again. When darkness finally came, it came gently, and the two figures beneath the cypress, man and horse, grew still side by side, their outlines fading into the dust-colored dusk. The next morning, the townsfolk of Tumbleweed Ridge rode out toward the ranch. They had come to check on the old man after the storm, though few said the reason aloud. The trail was quiet. No smoke, no movement, no sign of labor, just the slow drift of dust in the early light. When they reached the barn, they found it empty. The letter still sat on the table, weighted by a stone, the pencil lying beside it. One of them called out his name, then another. Only the wind answered. It was Sheriff Darrell Hodge who finally noticed the footprints, two set side by side, leading away from the barn and up the hill. He followed them alone, hat in hand, until he reached the cypress. There they were. Calder Hayes and his horse lying together in the shade, still as stone, peaceful as rest. Buck's head was tilted slightly toward the man's shoulder, their bodies dusted with gold by the rising sun. For a long time, Darrell said nothing. Then he removed his hat and stood silent, letting the wind carry his words. "The land remembers," he said softly. "All right, it does." Below them, the herd grazed along the ridge, their shapes flickering in and out of the morning light. One of the foals broke into a run, its hooves scattering dust that caught the sunlight and rose around the cypress like sparks. The others watched still and solemn as the wind curled through the valley, lifting the red dust into the air, again wrapping it around the two figures beneath the tree and carrying it home. A full year had passed since the storm. Spring returned to Dry Creek, quiet and deliberate, like a promise the earth had not forgotten to keep. The land that had once burned beneath red dust now lay soft and green. Rain came in slow, patient drizzles, washing away the last traces of the storm. Where cracks had split, the soil blades of grass pushed through like new veins of life. The hills shimmered in fresh-colored tender greens, golds, and the deep copper of wildflowers clinging to old ruins. The Three Winds Ranch still stood in ruin. Its house was little more than a memory of timber and shadow, the barn skeleton now wrapped in ivy and vine. But even decay had turned beautiful. Grass grew along the fallen walls. Purple blossoms climbed through the gaps in the stone. Birds nested in the rafters where the roof had fallen. A thin stream, once dry for decades now, wound around the base of the hill, its water clear as glass, singing quietly over pebbles. And through it all, the horses remained. Their coats gleamed in the sun. Their eyes shone with the calm fire of creatures that belonged only to the wind. There were more of them now. Strong untamed, their numbers doubled from the year before. They roamed the valley, freely grazing by the old fences, sleeping near the cypress tree that marked the resting place of a man and a horse who had never left. People in Tumbleweed Ridge began to speak of them with reverence. They guard the place, the townsfolk said, like he's still there watching over it. No one tried to catch them. No one dared. They called them the Hayes Herd, the horses that refused to die, the keepers of a man's final dream. By midsummer, the town gathered on the ridge overlooking the ranch. Someone no one remembered exactly who had suggested they build something away to mark what the land itself already knew. The memorial was simple. A slab of red stone taken from the canyon itself, polished smooth by hand, set into the hill that faced the valley. On it, chiseled deep, were the words Calder Hayes and Buck, the last riders of 3 winds. Below that, a smaller line read, he didn't rebuild the land. He just helped it remember how to breathe. Every month, someone, perhaps the same person, perhaps not, left a bunch of wildflowers at the base of the stone, along with an old cowboy hat. No one ever saw who placed them there. But the flowers never stopped coming. On the day of the dedication, Sheriff Darrell Hodge stood before the crowd. His voice was rough, his hands weathered by age and memory. He took off his hat, set it over his heart, and spoke softly. He didn't fight the land. He listened to it. And in the end, it listened back. The wind rose, then gentle at first, slipping through the grass, with a soft hum. It grew stronger, winding through the gathered people, fluttering their hats and jackets. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped. Because beneath the sound of the wind came something else. Faint, musical, almost like whistling. It moved with rhythm, curling through the valley, in a tune that was both sad and light-hearted, the kind that carried over campfires and lonely nights. A boy tugged on the sheriff's sleeve. "Was that him, Sheriff?" he whispered. Darrell smiled, eyes on the horizon. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe the wind just learned his tune." Months passed. The story of the last riders drifted from one county to another, traveling faster than the stagecoach ever had. It grew in the telling, sometimes changing, sometimes not. But always circling back to the same truth, a man who returned home, to die among the horses he'd once raised and the wind that never forgot his name. Among those who remembered him best was a young girl, Lily Mae Carter. A year earlier, she had often ridden out from town with a loaf of bread or a jar of jam from her mother's kitchen, leaving them by the barn door for Old Man Hayes. He had always thanked her with the tip of his hat and a few quiet words that stayed with her long after. Now older by a year, and touched by the story everyone spoke of, she decided to write about him. Her school assignment was simple. Write about someone who changed your town. But Lily Mae's words were anything but simple. Her handwriting was uneven, but her heart was steady as she wrote, "They say when the wind crosses 3 Winds Ranch, it sounds like laughter, his laughter." She wrote about how Calder once told her, "Ain't about owning the land, girl. It's about remembering how to listen to it." She wrote of the storm of the herd that lived through it, of the old horse named Buck who never left his side. She described how even now the horses still ran at sunset, one with a pale mane leading the way, and behind him all the bloodlines of freedom that had ever known his touch. Her essay ended with a title she thought sounded right, "The Cowboy Who Came Home." When her teacher sent it to the Tumbleweed Gazette, the editor printed it on the front page. By week's end, travelers began arriving from nearby towns from other states, all wanting to see the place where man and land had made peace. They stood by the ridge quiet as churchgoers waiting for the evening wind. And when it came, that soft, low whistle that seemed to curl out of nowhere, some smiled, some cried, but none doubted. The legend had already taken root. Evening came golden over Dry Creek. The valley blazed with light, turning the dust to fire and the air to gold. The herd gathered near the stream, restless with the fading day. Then, as if called by something unseen, they broke into motion. 8, 10, 12 of them running together, manes whipping like flames, hooves striking the earth with thunder. The sound echoed off the cliffs and rolled down the valley like the heartbeat of the land itself. Dust rose behind them in soft red clouds, catching the last rays of the sun until it looked as though the very air burned with their passage. From afar, they looked like shadows of ghosts, not of the dead, but of those who refused to fade. The wind rushed after them, carrying their breath, their sound, their memory. And through it, faint and steady, came the same old tune, the whistle of a cowboy, keeping pace with his herd. Every sunset, the people said the wind rides with him. On the hill, the red stone glowed with firelight. The carved names shimmered as though they were breathing Calder, Hayes, and Buck, the last riders of 3 winds. Children played near the base, their laughter mixing with the sound of wind and hoofbeats. A little boy tugged his mother's hand and asked, did he really come back? She smiled, brushing the hair from his eyes. No one ever left, child, she said softly. The wind remembers? When the last light fell, the valley turned molten, every blade of grass tipped with gold. The herd slowed, circling once around the ruins of the barn, then galloped into the open plain. Their silhouettes stretched long across the horizon, fading into the fire-colored dust until they became part of the sunset itself. The wind rose behind them, a long, low whistle that curled through every hollow, every broken fence, every stone that once held their story. It sang across the hills, through the canyons, past the cypress tree, where 2 souls slept beneath the roots. On the ridge, the memorial stone caught the last blaze of sunlight, its letters gleaming as though newly carved. The air shimmered around it, warm and alive. Some swore they saw movement, a figure perhaps for the briefest moment, a man on a horse, hat low, riding into the light. No one spoke. The wind spoke for them. And as the valley fell into twilight, Lily May's voice, or maybe only her words, seemed to echo through the fading light, carried by the same wind that had once shaped the storm. No one ever rebuilt the ranch. But every sunset, the land itself tells the story of a cowboy who came home, and the horses who never forgot. The words drifted through the hills, over the grass, and into the reddening sky. Somewhere far away, a hawk cried once sharp and clear, and then silence fell again. The last of the sunlight clung to the ruins like memory. Then the wind moved, one final time, sweeping through the valley with the sound of hoofbeats and laughter intertwined, as if the land itself was breathing, remembering and smiling. And so it remained. A place where wind told stories, where horses guarded dreams, and where one man's promise to the land became eternal.